I should start off by saying that I developed these seminars for this retreat. This is something that I've been thinking about for at least 2 years and doing some planning for that time. And Ramapad Maharaj and I, when we were discussing what I would present, I said that doing this would force me to work on it and get it done. The only downside is that I'm teaching this for the first time. Yes. So what I always like this with my classes, but especially if I'm teaching something for the first time, and I don't recall ever knowing about or being in any place where anybody taught this particular stuff before. So I would be extremely grateful for feedback. What worked for you, what didn't work for you, anything with the timing, anything with the content, anything at all. Okay? Like my godbrother Vaiseshika Prabhu says, I live to be corrected. So please respect isn't just praising others, you know. Respect is also giving people what they ask for. So I am very specifically and explicitly asking if you can give me feedback on any of these. We have 3 sessions that go together here. So any of these 3 sessions. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namane Namaste Sarasvati Deve Gauravani Pacharane Nirvase Susanivadi Paskatyade Satarane Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatham Vitam Stam Sajivam Sadvaitam Sadvadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakam Vitamscha Panchakalpa Trubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. So, you know, they say fools rush in where angels fear to tread, and I hope I'm not doing that. But I feel that these issues are of extreme importance if we're going to develop communities where we live according to Vaishnava etiquette. And this is basically, what do we do when things go wrong? What do we do when things go wrong? So our first part today is, what do we do when other people mess up? How do we respond to other people's mess-ups? We're going to look at other people's mess-ups in terms of following the principles, offensiveness. We're going to look at other people's mess-ups philosophically, and we're going to look at other people's mess-ups criminally. And then we're going to end today's session. So we're going to talk about those 3 things more externally. How do we behave when other people mess up? And then the end, we're going to talk about, what do we do internally? What's our internal response to other people's mess-ups? How do we feel about that person? How do we process it? As Maharaj said this morning, right, the biggest block is when we feel offended. So that's what we're going to look at today. Tomorrow morning, Krishna willing, we're going to look at what happens when we're the ones who mess up. I thought it easier to talk about other people's mess-ups first before we talk about our mess-ups. So tomorrow morning, Krishna willing, we're going to talk about our mess-ups. What do we need to do? And then after spending 2 sessions looking at that, then on Monday morning, Krishna willing, we're going to talk about, what is the relationship between penance and bhakti anyway? And I thought about teaching that as the first session, and I've made it the last, and so I also want some feedback on the order of things. Because oftentimes I like to talk about general philosophical principles and then application, but what I'm doing here is the reverse. I'm talking about application and then general philosophical principles. So what does it mean? Because we often say, based on Shastric statements, that, well, if you're doing bhakti, you don't need to do anything else. Like I said to my Tamil president right before I left North Carolina, I said, you know, if you spill milk on the floor, you don't just look at it and chant Hare Krishna, as far as I know. So we're going to look at that on a philosophical level. By the way, this afternoon and tomorrow afternoon, Krishna willing, we're going to be looking at Vaishnava etiquette and Vaishnava dealing through a very different lens. We're going to be looking at it through the lens of Varnashram. And we have our book there, Career Dharma, which was an Amazon bestseller for 2 months. And yeah, that's nice, huh? And it's been taught as an accredited undergraduate course. We have an online course also. We've certified now nearly 100 coaches in Career Dharma. We just got finished certifying some more. So we're just going to be looking at parts of it, especially relating to relationships. So this afternoon, we're going to look at how do we define the 4 Varnas. And I think a lot of you may be quite surprised. How do we define the essence of the Varnas and the temperament of the Varnas? Now, how that's related to Vaishnava etiquette is that if I have one kind of temperament and someone else has another kind of temperament, that's going to change how I relate to them. And that might be very useful. A lot of times what we think are someone's character flaws are really just that they have a different temperament. And so they see things through a different lens. Then tomorrow afternoon, Krishna willing, we're going to be looking at parts of Career Dharma that I don't generally teach. And that is how ideally all these 4 Varnas should operate in a devotee community. How we can have relationships between those 4 Varnas, which we call the 4 fields. And we have a number of temples in the world right now, 3 actually, 1 in Europe, 1 in Australia, 1 in India, that are looking at actually setting up their community relationships according to these principles of Varna Dharma. So usually when people talk about Varnashram, they think it just means that you have land and a cow, which is not very practical in Naperville, I think. Actually, it was interesting, I was reading a Krishna book this morning, how when Akura came to visit Krishna and Balaram, they gifted him a cow. And I thought, and I don't know how many times I've read Krishna book, but it's a lot, over 20 times. And somehow that never clicked for me. Like, what did he do with the cow? Like, you don't see him bringing back this cow with the chariot. So I was wondering, what did he do with the cow? But my point is, we often think about Varnashram just in that kind of a term, instead of really thinking about the principles of Varnashram. So we're going to be looking at the principles of Varnashram. What are actually the principles? And then we're going to be looking at how applying those principles in a devotee community goes a long way towards Vaishnava etiquette, and also is very related to what Ramapad Maharaj has been talking about, that when we feel difficulty, that we don't feel we're advancing in bhakti. Remember, he was reading that verse today, that you should continue to do your duty, and part of your duty is Varnashram duty, but we often don't know what that means. And so we often just say, oh, yeah. And one of the principles of Varna Dharma is charity, which was interesting because Mars was also talking about charity. Of course, he was talking about feeding people first. But this was a real problem where I'm saying, Sri Radhika wanted to feed me first, but that's not, I said I had to feed her first. So we were having this. I said, if she feeds me first, then I'm going to have the problem of thinking my stomach is better than hers, and then I won't make any advancement in bhakti. Okay, so this is going to be we're going to be talking about some heavy things, okay? All right? If that's not what you signed up for, you can just very quietly go out the back. But this is going to be a little heavy things. Okay, so we're going to be talking about what do we do when other people mess up? What do we do? How do we respond? How do we respond as a community when other people mess up? Have we had people mess up in our Hare Krishna movement? No, never. Not once ever. Okay, so the first category, we're going to be looking at this in 3 separate categories. So the first category we're going to be looking at, I just realized that I had never gotten my computer on Wi-Fi, and therefore it has the wrong time zone on it. Okay. So the first category that we're going to be looking at is people breaking vows or somehow breaking the norms of community. So they're offensive, they're breaking their vows, right? In this category, we're not talking about breaking the law. We're talking about breaking vows or community norms. Do we have anyone here with really stellar handwriting that can write really fast? Yes, okay. Well, I can do it if you don't want to, but then there's no mic there and the camera's not there. And okay. So I'd like to ask, what types of behavior are we talking about here? Not criminal. It's breaking vows or violating community norms, but not criminal. Yeah. Breaking the regulated principles, but not in a way that's criminal. So non-criminal breaking of the regulated principles. So this would not mean like taking illegal drugs or rape or something like that. It would be something. Okay. Anything else? Yes. Only the temple president. Okay. For senior devotees. Okay, all right. Anybody else? Yes. Breaking promises. Okay. Yes. Yes. Huh? Criticizing devotees. Okay, yeah. Yes? Cutting in the line. You've been in America for a while now. Being inconsiderate. Okay. Of course, that's a little nebulous. But, all right? Yes, Bill. Abusive language. Can it be to anyone? Anyone. Okay. Abusive language. Okay. Okay. So we could say fighting about ritualistic things. Yes. Okay. Being disrespectful in the, let's say disrespect in the temple room. Yes. Shaming. Okay. really trying to wrap my head around that. Like, okay. Stop that. You know. Okay. Shaming. Okay. Well, I think that's sort of borderline abusive language, but okay. Anything else? Can people see what she's writing? Anything else? Not being responsible. That's very related to keeping promises. Yeah. Being irresponsible. Saying you're going to come and do the artik and not showing up. Having some service you're doing, and then you just go to India for 2 months, you don't get anyone to cover it and tell other people it's their problem, or you don't say anything, you just disappear. We can put that in general temple room. Disrespecting deities. Temple room. Just put temple room. It would have to be non-criminal neglect. So we could say, yeah, not supervising children in the temple. That's something you wouldn't call social services for. Well, that's going to be another category. We're going to talk about that kind of thing. Anything else? Presenting classes on non-scripture topics. You're going to put that in the category of violating community norms? I'm really confused. Oh, that we're going to look at under philosophical deviation. Okay. All right. What I'd like you to do right now is each of you, this is just for yourself. You're not going to share this with anyone. Just write down what you hope to gain from this discussion. What would you like to gain from a discussion? And this right now, we're looking at how the community should respond. We're not talking about, thank you. We're not talking about our internal responses. We're going to talk about that later. Right now, we're just looking at how should the community respond to these sorts of things. And I'm sure some other things we haven't thought of. And what would you like to gain from this discussion? Yes. That's the idea, yes. So we're going to look at how these sorts of things have been dealt with by Srila Prabhupada in Shastra, and then we're going to have some discussion. So in a morning walk in Nairobi in 1975, Srila Prabhupada said, "Those who cannot strictly follow our principles, they should not come here. It is bad example. By mistake, if somebody does, he should be regretful and he should rectify. That is another thing. But not willingly, he should neglect. Then such person is not required at all." So Prabhupada making the point that we didn't want people living in our centers if they were not going to be following the principles. There's a time that Prabhupada said, better to have an empty barn than a barn full of crazy cows. Now, Prabhupada would give people second chances. He would, even leaders, temple presidents, and so forth, he would give them second chances, but he wouldn't give them unlimited chances. So there's a very interesting story in the Chaitanya Charitamrita. It's in Madhya Lila in chapter 10, verses 62 through 76. So this is where Kala Krishna Das was traveling with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and he was traveling as an assistant. And he was lured away by some women, the Bhattahari group, which were a bunch of thieves. They were basically like con artists, and they would use attractive women to lure people, and then they would steal from them. So Kala Krishna Das was lured away from Mahaprabhu's company by being attracted to these women. And then Mahaprabhu went there to rescue him. And this group, these thieves, they brought out weapons to attack Lord Chaitanya, and Lord Chaitanya bewildered them so that they attacked themselves. The weapons came and attacked themselves and cut them into pieces. And then Mahaprabhu took his servant by the hair and dragged him back. Then he kept his servant with him for the rest of his South Indian tour. But when he came back to Jagannath Puri, he talked to Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, and he said, look, my servant abandoned me to associate with the Bhattaharis after being allured by the women. And he said, I had to personally drag him back by his hair. And then he said, now I brought him back here, but now I don't want anything more to do with him. He can go wherever he likes. I no longer want any responsibility for him, and I no longer want to see his face. It was quite interesting. You know, Mahaprabhu kept him with him the rest of the tour, but then he comes back, tells Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, I don't even want to see him anymore. I want nothing to do with him. And Kala Krishna Das started to cry when he heard this. But the Lord just walked away and went to eat lunch. It's like, I'm not responsible, I don't want to see him, and I'm just going to have lunch. So then 4 prominent devotees, Lord Nityananda, Jagadananda, Mukunda, and Damodar, they talked among themselves, okay, what should we do? with this Kala Krishnadas. And they said, if he's just abandoned, he's going to be ruined. It's going to be devastating for him. So they decided, why don't we'll give him some service away from Lord Chaitanya. We're going to send him to Bengal and let the devotees there know that the Lord came back from South India. So the next day, the devotees approached Lord Chaitanya and they said, can we send somebody to Bengal to inform Mother Sachi and the other devotees that you've returned? They didn't say, we're going to send him. They just said, can we send somebody? And the Lord said, sure, do whatever you decide. So then after that, the devotees sent Kala Krishna Das to Bengal with Lord Jagannath's Mahaprasadam, and he went to Navadvip. He offered his obeisances to Mother Sachi. He delivered the prasadam and told her and the devotees that the Lord had returned. Now, this is very interesting because he got the mercy of Lord Nityananda. He got the mercy of Jagannatha Pandit. He got the mercy of Mukunda. He got the mercy of Damodar. So it's interesting. And it's also interesting that Lord Chaitanya didn't immediately abandon him in the middle of his tour. He kept him for some time. And he then had the association of Mother Sachi and so forth in Bengal, but still Lord Chaitanya rejected him from his personal association. And of course, we're going to bring this up also tomorrow. But of course, there's the very famous story of Junior Haridas, whose offense seemed very insignificant. It really seemed like a very, very slight deviation. But Mahaprabhu was actually, he rejected him. He would not have anything to do with him. And he was happy when he committed suicide. He said, oh, he's done a good thing. Which is, that's very heavy. I think it's one of the heaviest stories in the Chaitanya Charitamrita. But he was very much like that. Okay, so looking at these examples, I'd like us first, if you could just get into groups of 3 and talk about looking at the way that Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Srila Prabhupada dealt with people who had fall downs or who committed offenses. What would be an appropriate way for our community to respond to this sort of thing? Again, we're talking about things that are not criminal. We're not talking about rape and theft. We are going to talk about that, but we're not talking about that right now. So people who break their vows, I'm not talking about somebody who falls asleep one time and doesn't show up for the RT. Because if I was, I'd be talking about me because I did that. I would do the noon artik in the Boston Temple, and I would first nurse my baby to sleep and then have someone else watch him and then take a shower and go to the, and when I was, so you mothers with babies know that sometimes when you nurse your baby to sleep, you fall asleep. Yeah, so I fell asleep, and then it was 12:10. Where are you? So I'm not talking about something that's a very rare thing, but if somebody is repeatedly not following through on their obligations, they're repeatedly harsh, they're repeatedly offensive to the devotees, how should we respond? So please get in groups of 3 and talk about this, and then we'll talk about it a bit as a group. Okay, we're going to come back to the big group. So I'd like to ask some of you to suggest, I'm thinking of that we really want to look at this from 2 points of view. We want to look at this from the point of view of what's best for the community, and then we also want to look at this from the point of view of what's best for the offender. So anybody come up with anything that they'd like to share? What about for the community? Anybody like to share anything you came up with as far as the good of the community? Yes.
Both of our, oh sorry,
That's it.
So we couldn't get to Srila Prabhupada, but we discussed about Lord Chaitanya. One of the things that we discussed was how Lord Chaitanya was, although in the mood of Radharani, most compassionate, but he was not very tolerant of deviations or principles.
Mm.
And in that sense, there was this heavy-handedness, and then there is a little bit of soft-handedness with his close associates like Lord Nityananda.
Yeah.
The same thing with Madai pastime.
Yes.
He was ready to kill, but then Lord Nityananda softened that blow. And we saw in this pastime that you talked about too. And so there is this heavy-handedness that is required to protect the principles or the ashrama or the society. And then there is also this aspect of service to that particular soul that is mediated by the community members or the seniors of the community. Is not necessarily going against Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, but at the same time seeing how that person is being tied back or being taken care of in some way, maybe slightly at the border of the society.
Slightly what?
Slightly at the borders of the society.
Mm. I like that insight. Any other thoughts that came up, either from the point of view of what's good for the community and what's good for the individual in such situations? But we'll do it and then we'll come back here. We just have one wandering mic. Do we have another wandering mic? Oh, good. Okay.
We were discussing few different things, and the example from Kala Krishna Das, that pastime, where the four devotees actually discussed on how to bridge the gap between now Lord Chaitanya and Kala Krishna, how to bring them together. So we were thinking that when the four devotees have an intention of care about the other person's spiritual progress, who seemingly or apparently have done something like non-criminal violation, then it becomes more of a wholesome community caring towards that principle, toward that person. But if the intention of care is not there, then the talking becomes blasphemy or unnecessary criticism and proliferating unwanted thoughts.
Okay. That was someone over here we had? Yes.
Yes, both of the devotees in our group shared nice thoughts on how to respond when somebody does some transgression, not that's legal, but step one is speak to them directly and try to understand from their perspective where the behavior might have been coming from or what their intention was. And then if the behavior persists, then take it to some senior who can hopefully communicate to them maybe in a way that we were not able to. And then we kind of left it with a question mark of what if the behavior continues to persist? And yeah, and Kapil also shared a nice story of Prabhupada. We didn't have the details, but of Prabhupada responding when one devotee in Detroit was.
Yeah, I was there.
Oh, okay. So you have the details on it.
Oh, it was the temple president who wasn't, it was the same thing I'm thinking about, where he wasn't going to the morning program, he wasn't chanting his rounds, and the devotees threw him out of his position. And this is being recorded. So while he was out, which was just 3 weeks, the new temple president invited my family to move there and made an agreement with our family about where we could live and what we could do. So we uprooted and moved there. And then Prabhupada heard about the whole thing, and he immediately told the devotees to reinstate the first temple president. When he was reinstated, he told us that he wasn't going to honor the agreement that the other person made, and so we left. So I was right in the middle of that one. But yeah, so Prabhupada told them to reinstate him and give him another chance. He didn't last long, by the way, once he was reinstated. I mean, he lasted only a few months. By that time, we were already situated, I suppose. But yeah, I was right kind of in the thick of that one. Yes, from. By the way, Prabhupada did that on a number of occasions. A number of times when there was a leader who had some difficulty with following the standard devotional process, and the devotees would throw them out. Prabhupada would give them another chance. That seemed to be his general MO. Yes, please.
Yes, just as you mentioned just right now, one of the examples that we discuss in our group on Srila Prabhupada dealing with this type of situation, one of the examples was when Prabhupada kicked out of the movement the three preachers.
That's the next one.
Yeah, Brahmananda.
Wait, stop.
Okay.
We're going to do that in like 3 minutes.
Okay.
We're going to do it. Okay.
Yes.
That's philosophical deviation, so that's a different. I put that into a different category. Yes.
Maathaji, we were just discussing on the individual level. Mostly when we are in that situation, going through some struggle, nobody willingly want to give up what the promises they have given. So there is some underlying struggle that this devotee is going through. So trying to see beyond the external act, what is going on, and if you're able to empathize with them, and if we have space and relationship, being gentle and friendly encouragement for them to come out of whatever struggle they're going through.
So that would mean setting up things in community where there is some sort of counseling system, right?
Yeah, that point was stemming from, if I was in that situation, how I want to be treated.
Very nice. Yes.
Hare Krishna Mataji. In Kala Krishnadas episode, a big thing that pointed out was he was never abandoned completely. And
I'm wondering where to put that. I think it's kind of in both places, because I think, you know, being confident that my community of devotees isn't going to abandon me, like you're saying, how would I want to be treated? So when I look at this, I see that we want to protect. I really like what the first gentleman said. I thought you really looked at principles, service and care for the offender and protection for the community. And, you know, we may have to move somebody to the border, but we're not, but we're not abandoning them. And to get to the root of what's going on, to find out, to see if we can actually be of help to solve the problem. Do you think that having these sort of policies and attitude in place would make it easier for people to get the help that they need? Yeah? We don't always do all of this, do we? Right? I have to move on to other things. But I'd like you to just note what we're going to do on Monday, Krishna willing. There's going to be a session with how we're going to implement some of the things that we've learned, how we're going to move forward. And so if there's something from any of these sessions that you're thinking, oh, I can think of some way that we could implement this in our Naperville community, make a note of that somewhere. That's going to be, I think, our second session on Monday. Yeah, I know I'm going to have a first session. Is Mara's giving a first session Monday morning or no? No. So, okay, so I'm doing the first session on Monday, which is going to be the principles of the relationship between penance and bhakti. And then Marge and I are going to do a joint session about moving forward and implementing things. So if there's anything from this little discussion you picked up that you think, oh, this is something we could implement, note it on like a separate sheet of paper or a separate thing that we can bring up then. All right, now we're coming to your point. So now we're looking at philosophical deviations. This is tricky, folks. This is really tricky, okay? I mean, already it can be a little bit of a gray area in was the person offensive in front of the deities? That can already be a little bit of a gray area. But how are we going to deal with philosophical deviations? This is really difficult, especially when there's different statements on the same topic in the scripture, or different and seemingly opposite statements from Srila Prabhupada or Acharyas on exactly the same topic. So the GBC asked a few years ago the Shastric Advisory Council to write a paper on fasting on Ram Navami. And so many people said to me, why don't we just follow Prabhupada's instructions? I said, well, we really have a problem. Because in Prabhupada's letters, he consistently said, fast until the evening and break fast with an Ekadasi prep. And consistently, whatever temple he was at, on Ram Navami day, he would say to have a full grain fast at noon. So the instructions in his letters were consistent with the letters, and the instructions in person were consistent in person, but they completely contradicted each other. Right? And this is a situation we have with the origin of the jiva getting into Maya. It's not the origin of the jiva, by the way. That's why people say that. The origin of the jiva falling into illusion. And Prabhupada says opposite things in opposite places. In different places, he says opposite things. And so people can say, well, Prabhupada said this here. Well, Prabhupada said this here. Who's deviating? And everybody's, they're deviating. I mean, and I'm not going to talk about this topic, folks. We're not talking about this topic. And again, we're not talking about these topics, okay? This is not, if you want me to come back and teach hermeneutics, we can do that, but I'm not teaching hermeneutics on this session, okay? So we're not trying to resolve these issues. The issue of women gurus, it's the same thing. Prabhupada says 180-degree things different about women. Yes? 180 degrees. All the way, negative over here and all the way positive over here. And he says opposite things about women being guru in different places. Yes? And so one said, oh, you're deviating. Oh, you're deviating. And we practically have a war on our hands. So sometimes it's not so simple. I know of people who are outraged about in what order we offer things in Artik. Do you first offer to Guru and then Krishna? Because you can't offer to Krishna without first offering to Guru, and then it's the Guru who's helping you offer to Krishna. Or do you first offer to Krishna and then give Guru the prasad? By the way, in my own personal puja, I do both. But, I've heard heated arguments, and it's not just about ritual, it's about philosophy. What's our relationship with the Guru? What's Guru's relationship with Krishna? How do we approach Krishna? And it becomes a very heated thing. So it's not easy. And also, this is also not easy because, and this is a hard thing to say, but it has to be said, often our own material attachments and our own false ego, we disguise as philosophical positions. And we don't even know that we've done that. So we'll have some particular attachment to a particular philosophical, to a particular emotional thing. And we've convinced ourselves that it's principle and it's philosophical. Does this make sense to everybody? That's something you can easily see in other people. But it's not something we can always see in ourselves. No, you're being emotional, and this is your trauma response, and this is your. But for me, I'm standing on Guru Sadhu Shastra. So all of these situations make it very difficult to deal with philosophical deviations. And I don't know of very many instances when people have been dealt with strongly in our Hare Krishna movement for philosophical deviations after Srila Prabhupada's left. You know, I can't think of very many instances. Even instances where the GBC has decided this is a philosophical deviation, they have a hard time sometimes dealing with those people. And I'm not going to get into specifics. But I know of cases where there's GBC resolutions. This is the philosophical point, and people will present something different, and nobody takes action because it's such a difficult thing. So when Prabhupada was here, the most glaring case of this was when there were 4 devotees who were claiming that Prabhupada was actually God. And this is the only instance I know of where Prabhupada actually threw people out of the movement, where he said, get out, you're not in the movement anymore. And these devotees were saying that we failed to recognize that Prabhupada was God, and therefore we've offended him, and now our whole spiritual life is finished, and so forth. And one of the leaders contacted Srila Prabhupada, which was not so easy to do, and you didn't have a phone in your pocket. And when Prabhupada was furious, and he told this leader, immediately throw them out. And this leader took that very literally, and he put these 4 people on a bus with 25 cents to Detroit. So they get off the bus, and they had nowhere to go, and they had no money, and so they literally lay down on the side of the road and went to sleep. And they said in the morning, a little boy came with bread and milk and said, my mother saw you guys lying on the side of the road, and she thought maybe you were hungry. Anyway, eventually they did apologize to Prabhupada, and Prabhupada did bring them back and gave them sannyas and so forth. But that was a very strong dealing. There was one disciple who, again, I'm not going to get into the whole background. We have Manashiksha here. So there's a chapter there that Devamrita Swami asked me to write about the controversy on Raganuga Bhakti, the criticisms of Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati, especially by the Radhakund Babajis. And so there's an ongoing criticism of Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati and his followers, including A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, that we don't actually teach or practice any Raganuga sadhana in our organizations, and therefore we're not bona fide, and so forth. So there was one disciple of Srila Prabhupada who started studying Sanskrit, and he started getting in touch with these different groups, and he started criticizing Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati. Now there's one person who goes around the world criticizing Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur on these points. And sometimes devotees think that he's very erudite. But anyway, so when Prabhupada heard that this devotee was criticizing Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati, he said he will not attain prema for 10,000 births. Or he said he will attain prema in 10,000 births. Which, at least he will attain prema, but 10,000 births is an awfully long time. And Prabhupada was also furious and didn't want anything to do with him. We had a different situation, but with Kirtanananda, where Prabhupada had given Kirtanananda sannyas. He was the first sannyas, and he instructed him to preach in London, and he didn't. He stopped in London, but then he came to America, got up with his old buddy Hayagriva, and got some land in West Virginia on his own. on the way to getting that land in West Virginia, he went to New York and he started telling the devotees that they should wear monk's robes. And he started preaching all kinds of, they should shave off their shika and all sorts of things. And Prabhupada wrote back to the devotees in New York that they shouldn't allow him to give any classes and they shouldn't listen to anything that he said. Now that's also a little interesting because when Prabhupada found out they had gotten this property in West Virginia, he told them to sell it immediately. And they absolutely refused. And after a while, Prabhupada said, well, if you're going to keep it, then at least let's make it New Vrindavan. So that was also interesting, and Prabhupada kind of brought him back in. And later, what Kirtananda ended up doing later, it was kind of foreshadowed by that initial behavior, but he was preaching in a philosophically deviant way. I don't know of any other instances offhand where there was serious philosophical deviation. I mean, unless we want to count what Tamal Krishnamurti was doing, where he was stealing men from their wives to go on the Radha Damodar party. That's kind of borderline philosophical deviation, because he was basically saying all the householders were dogs and none of them were going to make any advancement. And, you know, the women were all the women in the movement were a problem. And he actually said that we should send all the women in the movement to Australia. And it got really bad. I mean, it got really, really bad. It was during this time that Bhavananda and Gargamuni told the women that we had to stand in the back of the temple room, that we couldn't chant japa in the temple room, that we couldn't offer artik if there were men in the temple room. I mean, I was in a temple where we had to wear our sari like this, and if there was a man walking by, we had to stick our nose in a corner, and it was and more. It was worse than that, but so to some extent there was some philosophical deviation there as well. And Prabhupada spoke and wrote, and he said, why do you think you're better than the acharyas? All of our acharyas have let women chant in the temple room. If you really see the woman as your mother, why can't you chant with your mother? And he said, you know, if you can't handle seeing women, there's so many women everywhere, then just go to the forest. You know, what are you going to do? How are you going to preach? He said, you walk down the street, there's going to be so many women. But it persisted. They didn't listen to Srila Prabhupada. They persisted with this. And then Prabhupada took very strong action in Mayapur. Although I must say that the reverberations from that have persisted even now to 2026. We're still experiencing kind of the ripple effect from that. But Prabhupada dealt very, very strongly with that. He dealt very strongly when the GBC took a non-GBC member, a Treya Rishi, and had him kind of like manage the whole GBC. And Prabhupada was furious. Again, he said, why you appointed somebody without my permission? He was very angry when, I think it was Bhagavan, tried to centralize everything in Europe. Prabhupada said centralization and bureaucracy is going to spoil everything. So Prabhupada would respond very, very strongly to those things. Again, the only time I know that Prabhupada threw people out was when they said he was God. And Prabhupada made the point, he said, if you think that the Guru is God, you're going to think, well, if I become Guru, then I can become God. That's the thing. But we know Advaita Acharya intentionally started preaching impersonalistic philosophy so that Lord Chaitanya would rebuke him, because he didn't like the fact that Mahaprabhu was treating him as a senior. He wanted to be treated as a servant. Then we also have during the 21 hours of ecstasy, when Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was giving out benedictions to everybody, and the devotees said, well, what about Mukunda? And he said, well, this Mukunda, one day he's with the devotees, next day he's with the Mayavadis. I don't know what he is. I don't know who he is. You know, I don't want to see him. And then the devotees said, you know, they told Mukunda, Mahaprabhu doesn't want to see you. And he said, well, will he ever see me? And they asked Lord Chaitanya, and he said, after 10 million births. And then what was interesting there is Mukunda's response, where he started dancing. Well, at least after 10 million births, I'll see the Lord. And then Lord Chaitanya said, okay. But we have this kind of strong behavior against philosophical deviations. Now, one problem we have with this is if you're the junior and the person who's deviating is the senior. I mean, you can say, well, this is the duty of the GBC, it's the duty of the temple presidents, it's the duty of the Shastric Advisory Councils, it's the duty of those people to spot and deal with philosophical deviations. But sometimes it's not that simple, and sometimes you're not going to write a letter to the GBC about everything. You know? It's just, I mean, sometimes you're hearing a class, right? That's what you brought up. Sometimes you're hearing a class and somebody brings up something. Of course, I'm thinking of one story. So this was in 75 and Henry Street. So the books were just coming out. You know, they were coming out as Prabhupada was translating them. So I was listening to class in the basement with my baby on a speaker, and the devotee giving class made a statement, and I thought, that's not true. Okay, so at the end of the class, I go up to the temple room with my baby, and I'm like, you said such and such. Where's that from? And he said, oh, it's in this purport that's just been printed from the book that was just Prabhupada just translated, and it was just printed, and it's here in that purport. And I'm like, oh, wow. So this is also a thing, you know, I've had a number of instances where somebody, I think, and Rupa Swami is not here, but I think it was him. In Detroit. When I think it was Tamal Krishna Maharaj on the Vyasa side, and I have to ask him to check on this. And Tamal Krishna Maharaj said something in the class, and then Prabhupada Swami, I'm pretty sure I'm getting the people right, said, Maharaj, did you just say this and this? And then Tamal Krishna Maharaj said, oh, no, that's not right. Like this. So sometimes you'll hear that, or I've heard people say things in class, and you're like, where's that from? What's your source? What's your praman? Right? And there's one devotee who I greatly respect, and he was telling this story, this Leela, and I'm like, wow, that is amazing. I never heard that Leela before. And so I asked him, I said, that was an incredible story. Where's that from? And immediately he got kind of defensive. And I said, I'm not challenging you. Of course I was, actually, but I said, I'm not challenging you. But this was also true. I said, I'd like to find out where it is so I could read more about it, and I could study it because I thought it was really nice. So that was also true. And then he said, oh, I heard it from such and such person. I'll see him again in December. I'll ask him, and you can remind me then. So I reminded him in December, sent him a little note. Maharaj, can you please ask such and such? Never heard anything else. So I'm never going to repeat that story. And honestly, really honestly, it made me hesitant to hear from this person. Although I like this person, and I respect this person, and I think this person is a wonderful devotee in so many ways. It made me very hesitant, because this is a person who tells lots and lots and lots of Leela stories. And I thought, what am I going to do? Check every one of them? It became the point. I thought, I don't want to hear this, and then I may bring it into my own preaching or whatever, and I'm not sure. So it can be very delicate when it's not the kind of thing we're going to, write a paper about. It's not the kind of thing we're going to have a GBC resolution about. It's not the kind of thing we want to have a 20-year war going on in ISKCON about. I don't think we should have 20-year wars going on in ISKCON about anything, frankly, but that's just my opinion. But it may be something where we want to make sure that we have the right thing. And then sometimes we have a problem in community where we don't want the community to be misled. And this can be a very delicate issue, because you're often dealing with someone who has some seniority, who has some influence, and they may be coming and they're saying something and they're preaching something that's going to disturb the community. And how do you deal with it? Again, because saying what is and is not a philosophical deviation is sometimes difficult to ascertain. So I remember going to one place, and the devotees asked me a question about japa that they had heard from the last visiting preacher, and I'm like, oh my God, this is awful. And to try to fix it, to do something to try to fix it. So what do we do? So I'm going to ask you again, if you can just about 3 or 4 minutes, pick a different people. Don't meet with exactly the same people we met with last time. 3 people. How should we deal with philosophical deviations in community? How should our community respond to something that appears to be a philosophical deviation? Okay, so if you can come back to the main group. So some suggestions. Yes, we have the Mike. Mike.
Hare Krishna, Maathaji. Maathaji, we three were discussing and Prabhu mentioned a beautiful point about if somebody speaks opposite to the philosophy, then first of all, we should be sure that whatever he's speaking is against philosophy with a praman ourselves. We should have that praman ourselves so that it's not an attachment, as you mentioned earlier. And if that person is not convinced, then we should talk to a person who he is related to, so like a mentor or a guru, so that he listens to them.
All right, thank you. Some other thoughts? Yes, there.
Hare Krishna Mataji. Our group first said we should look at it and see, is it a deviation in the principle or is it a deviation in the detail?
Oh, okay, like this.
And
Sometimes that's what we're disagreeing on.
yes. And what we were saying was, if it's in the principle, an action should be taken. If it's in the detail, can we tolerate it?
Okay. Nice, very nice.
I apologize, it's not a solution, but I guess my overlying question is just defining philosophical deviation seems nearly impossible if there's praman.
both sides.
On both sides. So I'm not sure, I don't even know where to go with solution if there's praman.
Okay, so now I'm going to offer something, and this is learn hermeneutics. So hermeneutics is the science of how to understand the words of Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra, how to reconcile things, how to understand deviations. So it's hard to teach the hermeneutics course because it's an 8-session course of 2 hours each. It's 16 hours, and so the Shastric Advisory Council has only been asked to teach it two or three times. I think 3 times on Zoom. We're being asked again by the VIHE, but it's a hard thing to teach, and I haven't found that many temples ask for that. Like it's on the list. You know, Maharaj was talking about how he gives a menu of seminars, so I have a menu. And practically nobody asks for that. Or they ask for like a quick summary and like... Yes.
We did have a discussion, and one of the things which we were not like so sure about is sometimes in the context of time and how much time and space we have to integrate it and fight back, sometimes we just remain silent.
So sometimes we tolerate things that we shouldn't tolerate because we don't want to take the time and effort. I mean, sometimes we tolerate things because we're convinced it's a detail. Sometimes we tolerate things like I told people I'm not going to die on that hill. You know, it's just like, I don't want to put my time and energy there. So yeah, you can think of what's going to be the effect. And is it worth the time and effort? And that's a very good question to ask. You know, is this something that I'm willing to die for? How much energy, how much time and energy do I want to put into this? Even if it's wrong, how many people are going to be hurt by it? Any other thoughts? Yes.
We talked about this yesterday, but if it's pretty clear that the deviation is deviating from Prabhupada's teachings, then in that case, it can be a splinter group of some kind, and you can make that separation. There are shades of philosophical assertions that are borderline ISKCON or borderline Prabhupada's teaching, or borderline clearly outside of Prabhupada's teaching, but borderline Gaudiya Vaishnava teaching, and things like that. But so if it's not Prabhupada, then it should be within ISKCON.
So this is, of course, a greater discussion than we have time for right now, but this is the principle of unity and diversity, the fact that there are many branches of the Chaitanya tree, and the fact that different branches of the tree may have different views on things, which again are not necessarily principles but details, and that in order to try to keep us from having 20-year wars going on that never get solved, like the perpetual Middle East fighting kind of thing, that it might be, sometimes it's wise to have a 2-state solution or a 3-state solution. And can we actually, have a pleasant relationship with people who are worshiping Lord Chaitanya, but they want to do it in another way rather than trying to get everybody to agree and to accommodate everybody. And this is something that people really strongly resist. That we have to get, absolutely everybody has to be under the same umbrella. But then we often have these things simmering for a long time. So especially if they're big things and people won't budge on anything. But this keeps coming up in our movement, doesn't it? About all kinds of things. Yeah, some other thought. Yes. We had 2 mics. Oh, okay.
We talked about having a mentor that you trust, that you can ask any clarifications or questions to, so that you don't just blindly follow with the crowd.
So trusted what?
Mentor.
Mentor. Kind of our dream in the SAC with teaching hermeneutics would be that at least on every continent, if not in every community, there'd be a group of people who are trained in hermeneutics that can deal with these kind of things. That if something comes up in community, you can go to them and say, hey, there's this contention, can you at least solve it for the community? Any other thoughts before we move on to the next topic? We'll take you and then that'll be the last one. Yeah, you, yes.
So 2 things we had. One is when the deviation happens with one person in the community, a mature, balanced devotee should address that one person so that it doesn't proliferate. And if it is already a group that is discussing this, then again, the group has to be addressed separately. Who
would do that?
That's another thing that I wrote down, that each community, if we have lots of different committees, this festival organization committee, so many committees, but perhaps we should also have a committee who would be thoroughly researching Guru Sadhu Shastra, and that's the committee for them.
Okay, so there's this kind of idea that a community has like some sort of group that specifically, like we have groups that deal with child abuse, that we also have some groups that we can go to if something foments in the community. Yeah. Okay, again, if there's something that's come up here that you think might be useful for implementation, please make a note of it. And this will be discussed on Monday. Okay, now we're going to look at criminal actions. It looks like I am going to be going a little bit over time. Is that all right? Or, if you leave at noon, you'll miss the personal response. Because that's what's going to happen here. Okay, so what kind of behavior, I'm not going to write this up there, but what kind of behavior are we talking about when we're talking about criminality? Child abuse, what else? Rape, theft. What else? Sometimes harassment is a crime, like stalking and things like that. Can be. domestic violence, any kind of assault. So we have, child abuse, rape, theft, assault, could be arson, although I don't know of many instances of that. Murder, yes. Huh? Misuse of power tends to go in the first category of violation of community norms, rather than in something that would be criminal. Yeah? Fraud. So if it's criminal fraud, yeah. Vandalism, okay. Thanks. Okay, so we're looking at these kind of things. Do these things sometimes happen in our devotee communities? Yes, they do. We wish that they never would, but they do. And especially assault is not uncommon, frankly. I know of a number of cases where there's been some assault situation. Of course, we all know that there's been child abuse situations, there's been rape situations, there's been theft situations, fraud situations, vandalism. I don't know of any arson. Murder, rarely. A couple cases of murder, a few, probably less than 5 that I can think of, but it has happened. So these things actually do sometimes happen. We'd like to think that they would never happen, but they do sometimes. Okay, I'd like you to write what you would like to get out of this session. Just going to give you a couple minutes. What would you like to achieve? What are you hoping that you will achieve from this session? Just for yourself. What do you want to get out of this session? What are you doing here? Why don't you just get up and leave? That's the question here. What are you hoping that you'll achieve here? Hopefully I won't need that much time. Is that a problem if I do? So we first want to point out that Srila Prabhupada made a very clear distinction between how he responded when devotees had some fall down from their vows and how he responded when people misappropriated funds or property. And then he would always advise taking legal action. So just a few examples. This is from a letter to Sukadev in November 1975. Regarding Manasvi, you immediately inform the police that he has misappropriated so much money. He must give the account or we shall prosecute. Oh, sorry, that was a letter to Guru Kripa in 75. And then he wrote to Sukadev also about Madhavi a little bit later. So the one was August, this is November. Regarding your question about prosecuting Manasvi, this is a local management problem. So therefore, you should issue some warrant. So Prabhupada was talking about getting a police warrant and prosecuting him for stealing money from the temple. Okay, this is a letter to Shripad Nirapan Babu in 1967. He said, Gaurachandra can be prosecuted immediately. I am not a lawyer, but if he can be criminally prosecuted on this ground of breaking the terms of power of attorney, you must immediately prosecute him on this ground and make him responsible for all the loss of property. So this is obviously some sort of problem with the contracts, where some devotee had signed a contract and this resulted in some loss of property, and Prabhupada wanted legal action taken. And this, I'm sure you've heard this. This is from Harisari's Transcendental Diary. he said, Prabhupada was very upset to hear that a young boy was hit by a teacher. He emphasized very strongly this should not be done for any reason. And he quotes Prabhupada as saying, if a teacher hits a child, he should not just be sent away, he should be hanged, he should be hanged, he should be hanged. And he declared, and he stabbed his right inlet fingers, he should be hanged, he should be hanged, he should be hanged. Now, not that Srila Prabhupada expected us to be vigilantes and go out and hang people. But in other words, he was saying this is not just a case that somebody's, drinking alcohol and we say you can't live on the property anymore. But in other words, that this was something where we should take some sort of legal action. Okay, this is a letter to Tejas in 72. So far, Dvijahari is concerned. If he tries to commit any further harm to you or attack you physically, inform the police and have him arrested. So this is a case of assault. Prabhupada says if he assaults you, you have to inform the police and have him arrested. So here's another one with theft. This is on a morning walk in July 74 in LA. Prabhupada says theft charges. He's stolen money and he has stolen something in Bombay also, and even somehow or other he goes out. Then he should not be allowed strictly either in this temple or that temple. Let him go to hell. So there Prabhupada wasn't talking about getting the police, but he was saying he can't be allowed in the temple and he should go to hell. I thought that was pretty heavy. When you think about, there's a story in the Chaitanya Charitamrita about Gopinath Pattanayaka, that Gopinath Pattanayaka was misappropriating some government money, and so King Prajaparudra's son wanted to have him executed. He was actually just trying to scare Gopinath Pattanayaka to come up with the money, but then the news reached Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. I'm not going to get into the whole story right now, but although Lord Chaitanya indirectly ended up saving Gopinath Pattanayaka to the point that King Prajaparudra even gave him a senior position and a salary raise. But Lord Chaitanya told him, he said, you shouldn't steal the government's money. This is, he avoided Gopinath Pattanayaka getting punished in any way. In fact, he was rewarded, which is kind of interesting. But he said, you shouldn't be stealing the government's money. We'll have a discussion of that. So he obviously he didn't want his devotees to be engaged in criminal activities. There's an interesting story in the Bhagavatam about Nahusa. This is in Bhagavatam 9:18-3. So Nahusa, the father of Yayati, molested Indra's wife Sachi, who then complained to Agastya and other brahmanas, and the saintly brahmanas cursed Nahusha to fall from the heavenly planets and become a python. So even though Nahusha was very highly placed, in fact, he had been running the heavenly planets while Indra was out of station. When he went to molest or rape Indra's wife, so he was thrown out of heaven and he was punished by being a python. So here we have the monkeys, pigs, and dogs in Vrindavan. So this is a lecture in 1972 in Vrindavan. Prabhupada says, it says in the Shastra, the karma is reduced for the devotees. Means in other place, if you commit some sinful activities, then you have to accept a body, and then evolution will take place gradually, and then you will come to the human form. But in Vrindavan, karmadi nirdahati, suppose for your sinful criminal acts, you become hog and dog. Next life, you are elevated. That is karmadi nirdahati. The karma, the cycle, a fruit of activities is reduced, but you have to accept, but nirdahati. So Prabhupada's saying, normally if you do something sinful, you'll have to take birth as an animal and then gradually evolve back to a human. If you do something sinful in Vrindavan, your karma is reduced, but you still have to have some karma. You'll have to take birth, they'll often say, as a monkey or a hog or a dog in Vrindavan, but it will just be that one life. But there will be some karmic reaction. We can also note that Prabhupada often talks about how when the government gives someone a punishment, that can reduce or eliminate their karmic reaction in future lives. So we'll say if you're a murderer and you're executed by the government, then you don't have to suffer anything for that murder in a future life. So one of the reasons for going to the legal authorities is for the benefit of the person. So part of it is for the benefit of the community. that we don't want thieves and rapists in our community, to protect the community. But the other is actually for the benefit of the person. That if they're punished by the government is said to represent God. Even if the government is not acting like Rajarshis, I don't know very many governments on the planet now that are acting like Rajarshis, but still, the punishment they give is considered to be given by God, in a sense. It's considered that this takes the place of karmic punishment. So I don't want to go into groups this time. I just want to ask if anyone has anything that they want to discuss on this point, or what any problems might be here. Yes. We should have a microphone, one on each side, so that makes it a little easier. And Jamuna Jivana, dance time. Dance time. He asked me if I was going to dance. It's a signal that he had to pass out the handouts.
I'm curious. I think obviously the response to any illegal activity should be taken to the proper authorities. I'm curious, what should the devotee's disposition towards that person be?
That we will be discussing in a few moments. That's our last and final topic for this morning.
Thank you very much for this topic. I feel like it's just so relevant and important. So one of the questions that was popping up again and again is two things. First is when something big happens, one of the things that comes to a devotee's mind is how would it reflect on the image of the organization? How would it reflect on Srila Prabhupada if I actually voiced what I'm going through? And so that was one part, like how does one address that?
Okay.
And the second part is, usually when someone is in the midst of something like huge, like, it just hits us at an emotional level, because we see this person has been helping us, and he's doing something deviant in a minute. So, what I personally feel there has to be systematic training, especially for people in administrative roles, so that they can quickly recognize and address it. Because without the lack of that knowledge, it can propagate very easily, because we have trusted that person who is actually, like, in a flip of a second, he changes to this.
Yes. Of course, thinking about image, how does it affect our image if we have to go to the authorities and admit that one of our members was a criminal? And on the flip side, how does it affect our image if we don't deal with it and then people say we have criminals in our organization? I'd like to ask, it seems obvious. Yes, somebody commits a crime, we should call the police. Why doesn't that always happen? And I was in a situation that I'm not going to tell you about right now, but I was in a situation where there was a person I'm not going to get into all the details, but he had repeatedly engaged in criminal assault against devotees, actually in a variety of temples, and the authorities absolutely refused to contact the police, and they asked the victims of these assaults not to go to the police. So what is it that prevents us from doing that? Well, why don't we just naturally say, okay, this person has stolen something, they've assaulted somebody, they've raped somebody, we have to call the police. Yes.
Prabhupada was extremely compassionate, and he has given shelter to all sorts of people. And so you are now being extremely rude, and you are breaking the law of Srila Prabhupada by calling the police. But that shouldn't prevent us from doing that in any case.
Okay, good. And this is why I made this distinction in this presentation between how Srila Prabhupada responded to people who did non-criminal offenses and how he responded to criminal offenses?
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
For the good of the community, we have to do certain things. For the good of the offender, we have to do certain things. I'm not talking about criminal offender, but other types of
But
offenses.
right now, let's just look, can we right now focus just on?
For the criminal, it is quite clear, and Prabhupada has given clear instructions, and even from our own personal experience, it is quite clear that the authorities like police and those, they clearly tell us you need to call us and you need to inform us, and that is crystal clear.
But any other reason you can think of why this doesn't always happen? Because it doesn't always happen. Yes. We should have a microphone.
I have one answer for that. I mean, I'll pass this on. I have seen it because in Indian, I mean, I'm sorry, again, I'm using the term, of late I have been very much on Indians. So there is a mentality within Indian community people that they find it very difficult to approach police or such authorities. They have like some kind of a mental aversion towards going to seeking the legal or criminal.
Any idea why? What is the aversion?
That is maybe some kind of
reputation. Okay. Yeah. So again, we have this kind of conundrum that yes, it looks bad if you go to the police and say, hey, someone in our community is a rapist, someone in our community is a thief. But if it comes out anyway, the cover-up almost always is worse than the offense. The honest truth is that most human beings realize that human beings are going to sometimes commit crimes regardless of what organization they're with, or that these things are going to happen. The fact that these things happen doesn't really surprise most people. But what upsets people is when it's not dealt with properly. That's much more upsetting than the actual thing happening. Now, of course, it's really a problem if the person committing the crime is in a very respected position. That's when you really have a problem, right? And this is a problem in all religious organizations, by the way, not just ours. That if some leader in the Christian organization or a Muslim organization or a Buddhist organization is found to commit a crime, so people do start to question that whole organization. But again, is covering it up the answer? But I think that is one of the main blocks. Any other thought on this?
So my thinking was the same, the reputation, because I remember that recently one incident happened in the Patna, Bihar. There was a very much, and the high authority of ISKCON is involved there. So that's why they did not take to media. Finally, it reached to media, and a lot of things happen in the, that media. There is a news happen with a week of time, they about ISKCON, how they're behaving. So they split in the two groups. Some authority people were involved in this is the incident in the ISKCON Patna, Bihar. So that's the reputation, because people don't take to the media, and finally the incident went to the media and went.
Yeah, and then it made a big mess.
Yeah.
Yes, Subha. This will be the last one, then we're going to go on to our final section.
Yeah, I was just thinking that it really also there's an element of different cultures have a different way of dealing with the same problem, and but nevertheless you see it like in the Catholic Church in the West, the same thing happens that it happens also in India or in different places. One of the things that I notice is this idea that within the family, you resolve the situation. You don't want to take it outside the compounds of the community or the family. And if it's even a gross deviation or a criminal deviation, is preferable in this situation to take care within the family. And then at the end, really, most of the time you see that things get covered and goes into normal. It's normalized. And then the criminal element gets perfectly reinstated and integrated. And even, the effects of trust and other thing is almost like cover, but it's still there, which is quite unhealthy. And at one point it just explodes. But it's this tendency that is there.
I think what you said is very deeply insightful, that there's a tendency, okay, we'll just take care of this within the family. Now that makes a lot of sense if we're talking about vow fall down, if we're talking about offenses against devotees, if we're talking about breaches of etiquette, if we're talking about philosophical deviation, that makes a whole lot of sense. But yeah, when we try to keep criminal things within the family, then we actually embolden criminals. And we create a norm of criminal activity. So yeah, in the name of being kind to the criminal, and in the name of keeping a reputation, we end up in a situation where, we're in a community where we don't feel safe. So this is just something to really think about. And I believe one of the most important things is making this distinction. Are we dealing with something that's actually criminal? And that Srila Prabhupada, when he dealt with things that were criminal, wanted to deal with them legally. He did not deal with criminal activities in the same way that he dealt with someone leaving his wife and having an affair. He put it in a different category. Okay. Now this is the last one. Thank you for tolerating that I've gone over time. I don't usually do that, but as I said, this first time I'm teaching it. And when you teach something for the first time, it's hard to have a sense of how long things take, so that's my excuse. But thank you for being tolerant with that. So now we're going to look at how should we respond internally. How should I respond internally? Especially when it affects me directly or it affects somebody that I really care about. Someone has offended me, or they've offended, my family member or my good friend, or maybe they've done a criminal action against me, or they've done a criminal action against my friend, or maybe the philosophical deviation has directly affected me. Something that's had a direct effect on me. How do I deal with this? That it's not just like somebody over there, but someone in my community that I trusted. I find out they had an affair with the wife of the couple they were counseling or something, or how do I respond to this when I interpret it or I understand it as something that offended me personally, that betrayed me personally? Okay, so what are some possible responses? What are some possible ways, good, bad, and ugly, that we could respond? Yes.
If I were, the direct recipient or was right in the middle of it, I would not be in a position to think clearly or objectively. So my first roll call would be to actually confide in someone I trust, like my mentor, my spiritual guide, to ensure that I'm, first of all, processing it right, and then trying to figure out how I should respond to it as opposed to reacting.
I like that. Any other possibilities for how we could be responding internally to these things? So far we've talked about external responses, right? How the community should respond, how the community should respond externally to these things happening in community. So now we're going to talk about how do I, as an individual, process things and respond when I hear about these things or when they affect me in some way. Yes?
one thing that we're taught to do is to internalize what is Krishna trying to teach me.
Okay, other thoughts? Do we have a mic over on the side? Now we have two.
So
It's funny, you know, materialistic people, they fight who can take, and we fight who can give. Right? Yes.
So, an internal response when we are in the soup is usually everything becomes very confusing. So, separating the emotions and facts and looking at the bigger picture.
Okay, someone else, other thoughts? Yes.
Maathaji, I'm thinking about Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakura's. I don't know how much it's applicable here. If you are able to see something in others, there is some kind of a thing inside.
At least maybe. I found that sometimes is the case. It's sometimes what disturbs me about others may be reflecting something in myself that might look very different and that I might not identify as the same thing. Yes.
In conversations or responses that I've heard to devotees performing criminal acts, more often than not, the response is that this person is no longer a devotee or maybe never was a devotee of Krishna. But I think we have to learn how to understand that they did perform criminal acts, and yes, they still might be a devotee of Krishna.
I could write that down. How would we write this down? So that's the kind of thing that we often ponder, right? I don't know if I wrote that down well, but, you know, could it be a demon dressed as a devotee like Pralambasura or, you know, Vyomasura? Or is it someone they're a devotee on some level, but there's some, and trying to sort that out. Okay, any other thoughts about different ways? Yes.
To be patient till the things are sorted out, not taking things into her hands, like not making sure that we are not going onto the same side.
Making sure you're not
acting in the same way in retaliation.
Oh, okay. Okay, let's look at some nice quotes here. And actually, first, before we do that, I'd like you to, again, take like 2 minutes, just write down what you hope that you will personally achieve from this. Please write down what you hope you will achieve from this next, 15 minutes. So you have your handy dandy handout. This is some analysis of how we can respond when we are the victim of something, or, particularly when we're the victim of something, more than just hearing about something that's happened someplace else, or, someone that we really care about is the victim of something. And again, that can be something just like an offense or a disrespect or a betrayal. It doesn't have to be an out-and-out assault or theft or something like that. So what's on the bottom here is lower than what's at the top. So the bottom level of tamagun is, it's absolutely this person's fault and I can't do anything about it. I'm just helpless. I'm just a helpless victim of other people's misbehavior. They're bad and I'm a helpless victim. Little higher level of tamagun is, this happened to me because I'm a terrible person and I can't do anything about that either. I'm just always going to be a terrible person. So in both cases, there's a helplessness. There's nothing I can do except feel awful. This thing has happened to me or people I care about because the perpetrator is a terrible person or I'm a terrible person, and either way, that's just what it is. And I'm just going to suffer and be miserable, and life is terrible. Maharaj put up a thing like that, like you see the world as just being aggressive. It's just, there's a nice statement in Krishna book, Chapter 20, the description of autumn, where Prabhupada says, the materialists see the world as very aggressive, but to the devotee, everything is happily situated. So this is when one is just thinking, everyone's my enemy or I'm my enemy. And this I'm bad and helpless can masquerade as humility. So blaming externals can masquerade as being concerned with justice, and blaming oneself can masquerade as humility, but it's deeply tamagun. Okay, in Rajagun, bottom level is, okay, I'm going to blame the externals, I'm going to blame this person, I'm going to blame the system, but I can control how I respond to it. It's their fault, everything's terrible, they're terrible, but at least I have some control. What do I do? And a number of you talked about that, like how to control my reactions. Okay, I'm going to talk to somebody, I'm going to wait some time, I'm going to make sure I respond appropriately. Little higher level of Rajagun is, I don't have to blame anybody. I don't have to be angry at anybody. I don't have to blame anybody. And the only thing that I need to work on is controlling my response to this. How do I respond? Okay, lower level of Sattvagun. I'm ultimately responsible on a larger karmic universal scale for everything that happens to me. Hare Krishna, Rake Ke, Rake Krishna, Hare Ke. We all have experience that people may try to help us and it doesn't work, right? People try to help us and it's not effective. And maybe we have experience that people have tried to hurt us and it hasn't been effective. And sometimes we've tried to help people and it hasn't been effective. Maybe sometimes we've tried to hurt people and it wasn't effective. That unless Krishna gives permission, it doesn't work. And Krishna will not give permission if it's not due to us. You cannot give somebody anything bad or good that's not their karma, other than bhakti. You can give someone bhakti if they don't deserve it. But you can't give somebody on an external level anything good or bad that they don't deserve. So in Sattvagun, the lower level of Sattvagun is, I'm ultimately responsible for everything I'm experiencing. What lesson can I learn from this? Let me focus on my lessons. Let me focus on how I can improve as a person. So the reason that this is a lower level of Sattvagun is you're still trying to control the material world. See, all of these are, you're trying to control the material world. I'm going to control the material world by being a helpless victim of others or myself. I'm going to try to control the material world by controlling my reactions while hating or not hating. And I'm going to try to control the material world by learning my lessons so that I can enjoy better. The higher level of Sattvagun, you say, I'm ultimately responsible, and so I've got to focus on moksha. I just got to get out of here. I'm the one responsible for being in this situation. I'm the one ultimately responsible for what I'm suffering. whatever it is I'm suffering, direct or indirect, and I just got to get out of here. So in bhakti, the response is, I'm ultimately responsible, and what I want to focus on is increasing my love for Krishna. I don't have to blame anybody. I don't have to feel guilty about anything. Right? And we'll look at guilt on Monday. I think it's Monday. Can't remember if it's tomorrow or Monday. Where I don't have to, like wallow in guilt, which is a very tamagun kind of thing. I don't have to wallow in blame, which is a tama or rajas kind of thing. But I can just say, hey, it's my responsibility that I'm in materialistic consciousness. It's my responsibility that I'm in the material world. However philosophically one wants to explain how one got here. And that what I want to focus on is prema. I want to focus on thanking Krishna, on gratitude for Krishna, and service to Krishna. Now you can see why I didn't talk about this first, because if we talk about this first, we think, well, it's all about just my internal response and I don't have to call the police or I don't have to ask someone to leave the community. You follow? Yes? Why I separated that. Okay, let's look philosophically at our internal response. So heavy statement. The destination intended for the perpetrator of irreligious acts is also intended for one who identifies the perpetrator. Now that doesn't mean you can't tell the police, this person stole from me. But it means it's assigning blame. Right? In 117:22, Pariksit says, "Oh, you who are in the form of a bull, you know the truth of religion. You are speaking according to the principle that the destination intended for the perpetrator of irreligious acts is also intended for one who identifies the perpetrator." So this is the thing here, that don't act in the same way in retaliation. Then I'm no better than the perpetrator. The perpetrator, consciously, unconsciously, knowingly, unknowingly, was causing harm for their benefit. That's basically the definition of evil, whether it's a small thing or a big thing, whether, as Prabhupada says, you're a thief of a cucumber or a diamond. You know, whatever category it's in, the person was thinking that their desires and their needs justified them with doing something wrong that harmed others. Well, I don't want to do the same thing. I don't want to say that my needs and my desires justify me with hating and blaming this other person. They're the ones responsible for my karma. As Prabhupada told Peter Burwash, never hate the instrument of your karma. And if we do, we're in the same thing of wanting to harm someone for our own satisfaction. And then, of course, this very famous verse, to become very tolerant, to become more tolerant than the grass that gets stepped on, than the tree that gets cut, that gets its fruit taken, to be more tolerant than that. That doesn't mean, again, that we don't call the police. Prahlad couldn't call the police because his father was a chief of police. And there was no CPO established yet. You know, I like to say Hiranyakashipu was the Adi child abuser. You know, so he didn't have that kind of an option. Haridas Thakur, you know, again, he was beaten by the government. And where was he going to go to? So this is not to say that you can't report something. This is not to say that you can't ask someone to leave. But internally, you're not accepting an offense. Internally, you don't accept the feeling of being offended. And this is some nice thing that Jesus says. He says, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who mistreat you. So Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, Aveshta means that a person does not have hatred even for those who hate them. Rather, one has friendliness toward them. One is merciful to them, thinking that they should not end up in unfortunate circumstances. So someone's done something hateful to you, but you're thinking, I don't want them to suffer. Now, you may want them to become rectified. Prahlad Maharaj wanted his father to become rectified. He said, my father has done so many grievous offenses against you, Lord, and against me. I want him to be free from those offenses. But he didn't want his father to be free through suffering. Prabhupada writes in his purport to Gita 12, 13, 14, this person is acting as my enemy due to my own past misdeeds, so it's better to suffer than to protest. Again, it doesn't mean you don't tell somebody what's going on, but it means you don't have a mood of I'm a victim and I have to blame. Krishna says one who's dear to him, he by whom no one is put into difficulty is very dear to him. And Prabhupada in this purport to 12.5 says, no one is put into difficulty, anxiety, fearfulness, or dissatisfaction by such a devotee. Since a devotee is kind to everyone, he does not act in a way to put others into anxiety. Someone has put me into anxiety. Someone has put my community into anxiety. Someone has put the whole international society into anxiety. But I don't want to put them into anxiety. And who is not disturbed by anyone. Again, Prabhupada's purport to 12.5. If others try to put a devotee into anxiety, he's not disturbed, because a devotee is always engrossed in Krishna consciousness and engaged in devotional service. Such material circumstances cannot move him. Generally, when a materialistic person is expecting some retaliation from an enemy, he's in a state of fear. So one has this conviction, Mare Krishna Rakhe Rakhe Krishna Mare. Of course, this very famous verse, Tatenu Kampam Sukshamikshanano, that when we're having some distress, whether we're having some distress on our personal account, on the account of someone we love, on the account of our community, on the account of our greater community, our response is that we say, Krishna is just karmadi nirdahati, he's reducing my reaction, and I offer more obeisances to the Lord. So now I'd like you to write individually. I want us to take just about now 4 or 5 minutes. Write individually. You're not going to share this with anybody. One time a devotee said that, write something you're not going to share with anybody, and then he asked us to share it. I said, Prabhu, you can't do that. So you're not going to share this with anyone but God. I'd like you just briefly evaluate how do you respond when in, the local or the general community, there's any of these things we've talked about. Deviation from norms, fall down, offenses, philosophical deviations, criminal behavior. How do you respond? Give yourself a little evaluation here. And then, are you happy with how you're responding? Is your response, is it helping you? Is it helping your goals? Is it helping the other person, and is it helping the community? So I want you to ask those questions of yourself. This is just for self-reflection. You're not going to discuss this with anybody. How do I respond when either it impacts me or I hear about people deviating from the principles, deviating from community norms, philosophical deviations, criminal activities? How do I internally respond? Is the way I internally respond, is it something I'm happy with? How does that affect me? How does it affect the individual who's the offender? And how does it affect the community? And if you have any feelings about improvement, we will be making plans on the second session on Monday for things that we want to improve. Okay, so just ending now, if there's anything that anybody wants to bring up, just we'll take like 2 minutes. And again, tomorrow at this time, we'll be looking at when we're the problem. Okay, so this time we looked at when other people are the problem. Tomorrow we're going to look at when we're the problem. And this afternoon, we're going to be looking at the Varnas to define them, to understand the temperament, so we can better understand ourselves and the people that we work with. And if you think you already know yourself and everybody you work with, so you can get a really nice, wonderful idea of the beauty and the logic and the brilliance of Krishna's system of varnashram and why Prabhupada wanted to institute it. So yes, some thoughts on this section about our inner response. We'll just probably take 2 or 3 points and then we will break. Do we have a wandering mic somewhere? It's funny how we always end up with 2 on one side. You know?
Thank you so much, Maathaji. Lots of churning going on. I was thinking on that particular point that Dayal Mukunda brought up, were they ever a devotee? I mean, it's like really we are looking at some really gross form of criminal act. But I often find myself caught up with someone whom I'm looking up to. They're really amazing devotee. We can clearly see how empowered and gifted they are in their devotional service. But the way they speak or the way they seemingly externally do things, it's not really aligning with the principles that Maharaj has been speaking and you have been speaking. Yeah. So for me, if they're really a devotee, how can they speak like this or how can they do like this?
For myself, where I end up coming to is, it's not my business. That I have found myself to be not able to know what's going on in other people's hearts. And I noticed that Yasoda and Rohini were fooled by Putana. The cowherd boys are fooled by Vyomasura. Even Balaram apparently is fooled by Pralambasura. Sita was fooled by Ravana. So it's like, I've decided that I'm not going to beat myself up for thinking somebody is very elevated and finding out they're not. Similarly, on the other end, Rahugana was fooled by Jud Bharat. Sometimes I can think somebody's fallen when they're actually very elevated. So I've noticed that my ability to say, oh, this person is a rascal, this person is a great devotee, that I can be wrong. And that it's not really my place to decide that kind of thing as far as like ultimate reality. What is my place is to decide to what extent and in what way I'm going to choose to associate with people. That is my responsibility. But my responsibility cannot extend to judging, was this person ever a devotee? Like Dvidvida, who was a devotee and then by bad association acted as a demon. Is this person still a devotee, but this also is going on? Were they always a demon just dressed as a devotee? Are they really a good, sincere devotee, but they're struggling with something, and the thing they're struggling with is very obvious, whereas the thing other people are struggling with may not be obvious? Because most people are struggling with something, yes? Anybody here not struggling with anything ever in bhakti? So, it's, right? And maybe it's just my struggles are different, that's all. So, it's more a question of deciding, do I intimately associate with it? Do I closely associate with this person? And in what way? Now, a concomitant question is faith. That we're like, okay, if somebody can be ostensibly following the practices of bhakti for so many years, how can they then do this thing? And that's a much deeper question than we have time to go into, because we're already way, way, way over the time that I was supposed to end. But I mean, something I do keep in mind that in our scripture, we have instances of people who actually were advanced in bhakti and for various reasons had some difficult situation. And then we also have examples in our scripture of out and out demons who apparently were very good at like austerities and rituals. And, you know, like Jarasandha was really together with the Vedic rituals. Hiranyakashipu was better at austerities than any. I mean, Lord Brahma said no one's as good at austerities as he is. So that sometimes things that can appear as bhakti are not. So in both ways, sometimes things that can appear as bhakti are not, and sometimes a person who generally is a devotee is there's some other thing going on. Both of those things can operate. So I was in the movement. Let's see, at that time, maybe 3 years. Yeah, 3 years. And I experienced some very bad behavior from a temple president that really shook me. And I was like, you know, I assumed that if you were a temple president, that you were automatically more spiritually advanced than if you were a pot washer. First of all, this was my assumption, that if you had, that the title that you were given was somehow indicative of your spiritual status. So I thought, well, if this person who's a temple president, if they could have this behavior, then Krishna consciousness must not work. And I had a real crisis. I didn't stop chanting my rounds or following the principles, but I was really struggling. And I was thinking, you know, maybe I'll just leave. And then I think, where will I go? And who will I be with? And what will I do? And I don't want to be with meat eaters. And, you know, I was like trying to figure this out. And my husband said some things that really changed me. He said, you know, Prabhupada had godbrothers that were nonsense, but that didn't discourage him. Prabhupada talked about one of his godbrothers who, you know, had court cases against the movement, and he said he got the properties. He said he got the properties, but he didn't get the mission, which is interesting. And then he also said in a university, you go to any university, and so many students are not studying, right? There are some students, all they're doing is partying. Even you go to the top universities, you go to Harvard and Yale and Oxford and Princeton, I'm sure there are some students there just partying and they're not going to graduate. And that's not how you don't judge the university by that. You judge the university by the professors and the graduates and their overall thing. And so that it shifted me. It was a permanent shift that sort of, I was never that disturbed again. I was never that shaken again. And I've been through a lot of stuff that you don't want to hear about. But I was never shaken to that extent that I thought, okay, my faith that there's a God and that God is Krishna and that Prabhupada is giving me the way to find that God who is Krishna, that was there. And that I'm going to find many people in the society of Krishna consciousness who are actually experiencing Krishna consciousness. And I'm going to find people in our movement. Maharaj is talking about Lord Kapila Dev. Kapila Dev talks about bhakti being performed in Tamagun, Rajagun, Sattvagun, and transcendence. Right? That's the verses he's referring to. And so there's going to be people in our Krishna consciousness movement who are doing bhakti in Tamagun. Sorry, but there will be. There are people in our movement who are going to be doing bhakti in Rajagun. There are people in our movement who are going to be doing bhakti in Sattvagun, and there are people in our movement who are going to be doing bhakti transcendentally. So first of all, let me try to do bhakti at least in Sattva. Like, at least in Sattva. Better that I do it transcendentally. If I can't do that today, then let me at least do it in sattva. Let me work it where I'm at, and let me try to associate with the other people in ISKCON who are doing bhakti transcendentally or in sattva, or at least aspiring for that, and show my respects within the mind to those who are doing bhakti in Rajagun and Tamagun. And if people are doing bhakti in Rajagun and Tamagun, what did Maharaj quote? They're offering oblations into ashes. They're offering oblations, but they're offering oblations into ashes. They may be very good at the rituals. They may be very good at the show. They may be very good at the, Let me not be like that, is the bottom line. Let me not become like that, and let me not be surprised that we're going to have some percentage of people that are like that. That's just... I'm just going to assume Krishna knows what he's talking about. I usually find that a pretty good idea. And that's just the way it is. And that, again, let me not be like that. And who knows? Maybe this is my 100th birth practicing bhakti, and maybe I had 25 births practicing bhakti in Tamagun. But seriously, really seriously. So... Even if someone's doing bhakti in Tamagun, eventually, like Prabhupada says, if you're lighting a fire and pouring water, eventually it will get going. So that's what's helped me. Okay, thank you very much for all of your patience. My apologies that I went over time. We do have a book table set up with my books here if you're interested in getting a book. So the temple is selling the books. I'm happy to sign them for you if you're interested in that. So anything good in this presentation is from Srila Prabhupada and our Shastra and all of our acharyas. Any mistakes or anything wrong in this presentation is my responsibility. So any mistakes here, please either correct me or ignore them, and please take the good. Thank you. Hope to see you this afternoon, Krishna willing. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.